Hey Team Bio, welcome to your screencast on biogeochemical cycles. Biogeochemical, it's a big fancy word. It means bio, life, geo, earth, chemical, the elements. Biogeochemical cycle is just a fancy way to say nutrient cycling. Nutrient cycles. We are talking about the nutrient cycles that make up organic molecules. So, organic molecules. We know that the definition of organic molecule is not the grocery store definition of organic, but the scientific definition of organic is that it contains carbon. All organic molecules contain carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Maybe not all. I can think of methane, doesn't contain oxygen, but it does contain carbon and hydrogen. So caveat to that, little asterisk next to that all. And then some organic compounds contain phosphorus, and nitrogen. So we're going to be talking about the biogeochemical cycles of things that contain these different elements. Okay, first off, water. Water's a super important one. The chemical formula is H2O, and it's super important because all cells are immersed in aqueous solutions. An aqueous solution is a watery solution. And you might not think of your body as being a watery solution, but actually underneath your skin is a watery, salty solution that all your cells are bathing in. And the same is going to be true of any living thing that's going to have water inside and outside some of its cells, if not all of them. So water's super important for life. It's got a couple different abiotic reservoirs. We find water in the ocean and under the ground, in lakes and ponds and streams and rivers, and in the air. So these are all abiotic reservoirs of water. The sun powers the global water cycle. The sun is shining down on the earth and it causes evaporation. If you look at the ocean, on net, evaporation exceeds precipitation. So water that is held as vapor in the atmosphere precipitates out. But over the ocean, there's more evaporation happening than precipitation. Some of these clouds are pushed from the ocean over the land by the wind. And here we see that precipitation exceeds evaporation and this word transpiration that you might not have heard of yet. Transpiration is the movement of water by plants. Oops, not plants. Plants. From their roots to their leaves. And this is achieved by capillary action. And ACT, that's a T. Capillary action, which we'll describe in much greater detail in our next unit when we talk about water and how it works. But plants move water from their roots all the way up to their leaves, which in the case of some trees is hundreds of feet, which is really incredible, passively. They don't even use any energy to do it. So transpiration moves water, and some of that water is lost from the plant out the base of a tiny little structure in their leaf called the stomata and ends up in the air. Okay, so We have precipitation, and then some of that water is flowing back to the ocean via rivers, which we're going to talk about later on, connect these ideas in class when we talk about the idea of a watershed. So all the area of land that is draining down a river into the ocean. If you notice here, we have the Connecticut River Valley watershed here, all in green, and it's quite massive. And here's the White River right here, and here we are just north of the White River. In Hanover, Norwich, Lyme area. Okay, so that's water. Next up, we have carbon. Okay, carbon, C. Carbon is really important because it is the backbone of all organic molecules. The major abiotic reservoir that we're going to be talking about is the atmosphere. But also a huge abiotic reservoir that's not in this image is the ocean. So know that. And also another massive abiotic reservoir that is rapidly returning to the atmosphere is fossil fuels buried underground. So fossil fuels meaning coal and oil and gas are hydrocarbons that are ancient plants that have been buried underground for long periods of time and changed into fossil fuels. Okay, so CO2, but the abiotic reservoir we're going to be talking about today is CO2 in the atmosphere. CO2 moves from abiotic reservoirs into biotic reservoirs through the process of photosynthesis. Photosynthesis, the chemical equation is CO2 plus H2O becomes C6H12O6 plus O2. Note that this is the unbalanced form. If you add sixes here, here, and here, it becomes balanced. Okay, but why do we care about this process, photosynthesis? Because it's making glucose. And this is the way carbon goes from its abiotic reservoir in the atmosphere into the biotic reservoir of living things. Anything doing photosynthesis, so plants, algae, which are technically a protist, and cyanobacteria, are incorporating carbon from the air into sugar, and then they serve as the primary productivity for the ecosystem, and all living things above them on the food chain are going to consume them, as you have seen before in our discussion where we talked about how nutrients are going to cycle from producers to consumers to higher level consumers and decomposers back into the atmosphere. Notice here that the way that that CO2 is returning to the atmosphere is through this process of cellular respiration. Cellular respiration has the exact same chemical formula as photosynthesis, just in reverse. We have C6H12O6 plus O2, so we're burning glucose and we're combusting it, we're releasing CO2 and H2O. Notice that all living things are doing cellular respiration. Primary consumers, higher level consumers, decomposers are also doing it, but also producers are also doing cellular respiration. They do photosynthesis and they do cellular respiration. They do both. Okay, phosphorus. Phosphorus is a super important nutrient. It's necessary for making nucleotides. So DNA and RNA. You learned in your screencast last night that there is a sugar phosphate backbone to DNA. Well, that phosphate comes from phosphorus. Okay, the abiotic reservoir of phosphorus is in rocks. These rocks weather and release phosphate into the soil, where it is assimilated by plants and or other producers. This shouldn't say plants, this should say producers. And this shouldn't say animals, it should say consumers. And it cycles through the abiotic reservoir, just as we talked about before, from producers to consumers and decomposers, where it's going to be re-released into the soil, where it could be reassimilated, or it could dissolve in water, and then precipitate out of that water, usually at the base of an ocean, and then it's going to take millions of years to turn back into rock. We are rapidly depleting the world's reserve of phosphorus by mining it and then putting it on our fields and cropland, because if phosphorus is a limiting ingredient on life, if you don't have enough of it, you can't make your DNA and RNA. However, extra phosphorus is running off of our fields through watersheds out into the ocean, where it is going to be dissolved in the ocean and not capturable by us for millions more years until it turns back into rock. So phosphorus is what we call an endangered element. Nitrogen. Nitrogen is a super important element because it is necessary to make proteins. The major abiotic reservoir of nitrogen is as gas in the air. About 78% of the atmosphere is composed of nitrogen in the form of N2. This is a highly stable molecule, but it's not usable by most living things. In order for it to be usable by plants or I should say producers and other things that depend on those producers for food, so consumers and decomposers, it has to be transformed into a usable form that can only be accomplished by bacteria. So there are some types of plants that have bacteria living in their roots. They form a symbiotic or a mutualistic relationship, and this is called mycorrhizae or mycorrhizae. I've heard it pronounced both ways. These nitrogen-fixing bacteria live in these root nodules, and they fix nitrogen and they convert it into a form that the plant can use. These plants are often really high in protein. So an example of that would be a bean, has this mutualistic bacteria living in its roots. But there are also free-living nitrogen-fixing bacteria that live in the soil, and they convert the N2, nitrogen gas, into ammonia and then ammonium in the soil. And there are other types of bacteria that can convert this into nitrates, which are types of nitrogen compounds that are more easily assimilated by producers. And the nitrogen is going to pass through its abiotic reservoirs as consumers eat producers and then decomposers. And then there are also bacteria here that can denitrify the soil and take these nitrates and convert them back into nitrogen gas. So this is the nitrogen biogeochemical cycle. Now, just like phosphorus, nitrogen is a necessary ingredient for living communities, and it's often one of the limiting factors on growth of in any certain area, on primary productivity, the amount of plant growth that can happen in an area. And this was a fixed thing for a long period of time. People got extra nitrogen to put on soil by harvesting poop from other organisms, like bat guano was a major source of nitrogen. This is up until 1913. 1913 is the year that a process called the Haber-Bosch process. Oops, there's a C in there. The Haber-Bosch process was put into industrialized production. The Haber-Bosch process is a set of chemical reactions that takes nitrogen gas and converts it into ammonia. And notice what happened to the human population in the years following the invention of this process of fixing nitrogen. The world population totally took off. This is called, the Haber-Bosch process has been called the detonator of the population explosion. 50% of the nitrogen in your body originated from the Haber-Bosch process. But there are consequences for both the amount of nitrogen and the amount of phosphorus that we are using to commercially grow our food. And we're going to be talking about the connection between these processes and dead zones in the ocean in class in the coming days. So know that there's a connection between what's happening here and what's happening here at the mouth of the Connecticut River. Okay, that is all. See you in class next week.